Sanda, also known as Sanshou or Chinese kickboxing, is one of the most intense combat sports on the planet. It blends the ancient traditions of Kung Fu with modern day combat sport mechanics. It includes punches, kicks, throws, sweeps and takedowns. So why isn't this martial art more popular? And it is not a matter of skill, because we've seen Sanda fighters like Ilong, the self-proclaimed Shaolin monk, go up against Buoko, one of the best Muay Thai fighters of all time, and even win. So in this video, I'll talk through the amazing history of Sanda. We'll discuss some of the rules and techniques used in this sport, and finally answer the question, why isn't Sanda more popular internationally? If you're into martial arts and combat sports breakdowns, history and techniques, hit subscribe now to make sure that you stay up to date with my latest videos. So before we dig in, a little bit of my background with Sanda. I first learned about Sanda when a guy showed up at a weekly sparring exchange I was hosting. He'd actually trained with the national team in Beijing, and as soon as we started sparring, I could tell right away this guy knew how to fight. We exchanged regularly, and this friend taught me some of the fundamental techniques and skills used in Sanda. And then later, in a couple of local kickboxing tournaments, I went up against Sanda fighters. So I got to experience this from both sides. And if you want to see what my takeaways were from these fights, then make sure you stick around to the end. So for centuries in China, Kung Fu masters, rivals or enemies would settle their differences or test out each other's skills in challenge matches. Traditionally, they would take place in a village square on a raised platform called a Lei Tai. This was often just a few feet off the ground. However, unlike the movies, they often weren't like 20-foot high podiums where people would fall to their death off the edge. Lei Tai fights had no rules. You could do whatever technique was required, and because of this, they were dangerous and even deadly. As a result, these Lei Tai fights were banned in the 1920s, seen as being barbaric, backwards, and even associated with rebellions against the government. However, they certainly still continued underground or out of sight of the authorities. So later on, in the 50s and the 60s, there was a push to develop a national style of martial arts, or to preserve the historical aspects of Kung Fu. This led to the early creation of modern Wushu. Wushu is the name for the unified system of Kung Fu that has been made into a sport. One part of it is Taolu or forms, and the other part is Sanda or Sanshou as it used to be known, which is free fighting. The combat sport part of Sanda originally started in the military, however it quickly gained popularity and spread out to the civilian population as well. So in the 70s and the 80s, Sanda was refined with unified sets of rules and regulations being developed. So by the 1990s, a number of Chinese fighters were competing internationally, and there were huge sporting events organised in China. And by the 2000s, Sanda had developed into a recognisable version of the sport we see today. It is still often fought on a Lei Tai raised platform off the ground, harking back to days gone by, and has become the go-to method for Kung Fu people to test their skills. Even in the Shaolin Temple, they fight under unified Sanda rules. Nowadays, Sanda is incredibly popular all across Asia, but is yet to get that same kind of foothold in the West as sports like Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu have. Possibly something to do with the rules and the techniques themselves, as we will look at next. In terms of the techniques found in Sanda, they typically draw from three main sources. The first of which is Western boxing. Coaches throughout the development of Sanda took a lot of influence from Western boxing because they were pragmatic and they could see that generally when it comes to upper body, boxers were dominating in combat sports. What's more is that many of the punches that are found in boxing, when you're wearing gloves, mirror a lot of the Kung Fu techniques that already existed in the traditional arsenal. For example, something like a straight fingertip thrust to the eyes with a boxing glove mirrors the exact same technique as a cross or a jab. Many of the kicks in Sanda come from traditional Kung Fu, schools like Shaolin. Sanda fighters love to side kick, particularly off the front leg. This is usually a bit more like aggressive and with more follow through than Taekwondo, for example. However, it is also very fast and usually followed up with quick hands in a combination. There are also lots of spin kicks and jumping kicks, really getting some of that traditional Kung Fu style in there. Finally, many of the throws and takedowns are taken from Shuai Jiao, which is traditional Chinese folk wrestling. They involve catching kicks and sweeping opponents, going straight in and using shoulder throws, hip throws and head throws. And by the way, if you haven't seen it already, I tried to adapt my own kung fu to participate in a kickboxing fight, and if you want to see how that went, you can click on the link up here. A typical Sanda fight consists of 3 2-minute rounds. They are best 2 out of 3, so if someone has won the first 2 rounds, they won't continue to a third. If it's been 1 each, then they'll go to a third, and if the third is a tie, for example, they might even go to a fourth. In amateur competitions, fighters wear gloves, headgear and chest protectors. They are allowed to punch, kick, throw, sweep or use takedowns. However, they cannot knee to the head and there are no elbows allowed. In professional matches, there is less protective equipment and fighters are allowed to knee to the head, but once again, no elbows at all. Fights can be won via knockout or on points. You can score points by landing clean punches, kicks or knees. However, the most effective way to score is to get a clean takedown on your opponent while staying standing. You can also win a round outright by throwing your opponent off the Lei Tai platform. The rules and the round length of Sanda make it very fast paced, because while throwing, tripping and sweeping is allowed, you only have 2 seconds in a clinching position from which you must deliver your throw or sweep. This means fighters need to close distance extremely quickly. They need to get in and deliver their throw or takedown as fast as possible. So this combination of long range kicks, punches and then closing the distance for really fast throws, coupled with the short round length, makes Sanda extremely exciting to watch. The pace is absolutely furious. So all of this leads us back to the big question, why isn't Sanda more popular? The first problem that I've identified with Sanda, branding and identity. Possibly because China has so many different styles and schools of martial arts, trying to unify them is a difficult task. We also have the problem that we've imported certain techniques. For example, many traditionalists of Kung Fu won't like the fact that we're using Western boxing as a basis here. Similarly, there are probably many combat sport fighters who won't want to fight using Kung Fu kicks because they likely see them as unrealistic or impractical. And on top of all that, for the last few years there has been some very bad press internationally surrounding traditional Chinese martial arts, particularly with the Chinese MMA fighter Xu Xiaodong taking on these traditional Chinese martial arts masters and beating the crap out of them in a few seconds. A second physical reason belongs to the striking and grappling elements of Sanda. While many fighters are great at kicking and great at delivering these throws, the lack of clinching can cause a real problem for a lot of fighters. They're not going to be used to throwing elbows and receiving elbows or knees. They also don't have the experience of being in a clinch and trying to counter grapple or to get a counter throw. Furthermore, because fights don't go to the ground, there is no extended grappling period. A third consideration might be the short rounds and the pacing of Sanda. So because rounds are short, grappling time is short, and there are normally only 3 rounds, the pace of Sanda is very explosive and very quick. However, this means when you put a fighter in a scenario where they have to fight for a much longer time, they will often fatigue very quickly. This is something I found fighting a Sanda guy. He came out with some really hard punches and kicks, got me with a couple of good takedowns, but after we hit like the 3-minute mark, he was exhausted and I was just punching away and he was like charging in with his head down and visibly out of breath. Now, I'm not saying this is anything hard and fast because that could have just come down to the individual fighter. However, I think training in this really short explosive burst type scenario would make it more difficult to transition to longer form combat sports. And the final reason I've noted is international exposure. Firstly, most Sanda competitions are internal in China. Because it is such a huge country with so many people, there is no real drive to ship Sanda out internationally, and fighters will often prefer to participate in local tournaments because why do they need to bother going anywhere else? On top of that, we have a language barrier. It's difficult for me to search for cool Sanda footage or to watch these competitions. I don't have any commentary in English. I can't even read the text talking about the the fights. And to amp that up even further, we also have restricted social media in China. I was in China last year and I was trying to get onto Facebook and YouTube and all these different sites, and I just couldn't get anywhere. So unless you're an active Chinese social media user, it's much harder to get access to the kind of clips or videos that we're used to nowadays. Don't get me wrong, I think Sanda is an incredible sport. It's great to watch, it's great to participate against, and fighters are incredibly skilled. But whether or not it can reach the same kind of levels as Muay Thai or MMA or even Western kickboxing remain to be seen, and I think some fundamental changes would need to take place to do so. What do you think? Have you ever practiced Sanda? Do you think it can ever reach the same level of acclaim as Muay Thai? If you're interested in knowing more about the history of martial arts, you can check out my book, The Legendary Masters of Martial Arts. Here I break down 10 of the most important myths and legends surrounding martial arts masters, including those like Bodhidharma and Nai Kanon Tom, the patron saints of Shaolin and Muay Thai themselves. This is an affiliate link, so if you want to support the channel and help me keep on making videos, please click and buy using this link. Until next time, train hard, stay safe, thanks for watching.